Good morning. Homework 14 is due on Thursday, and then Sunday next week we're having that bonus quiz that I previously mentioned. So that's the announcements for now. We're going to continue in Chapter 15, which, just as a reminder, is all about estimating costs and how we're having to account for things like indirect costs. Do you have any questions related to the announcements? Okay. Well, a lot of these ideas are relatively simple, and the nice thing about that is it allows you to begin your review for the final exam on the more complex material. So I think that you shouldn't allow the simplicity of Chapter 15 to get you into a false sense of security, because there was some pretty sophisticated stuff that we've been doing with benefit cost analysis and time value of money calculations. So it's in a way a mixed blessing that you have this easy material at the end of the semester, and also we've already finished the project, so that's not weighing on your shoulders. But my recommendation is you should definitely think a strategy for how to comprehensively review all of the material for the exam. All right, having said that, let's talk about indirect costs. What are indirect costs? Just as a brief review. Well, remember that there are some direct costs that we can easily allocate to what the business is doing. In the case of a manufacturing company, you can know exactly how much they're spending on raw materials. You can know how much they're spending on the machinery that they purchase, on the labor for assembling and producing whatever it is that they make. But then there are certain costs that are more difficult to estimate on the basis of how much of the cost is linked to a certain number of the products. And that's what we call the indirect costs. And so indirect costs are difficult to assign to a specific output. A company may do a lot of things. For example, they make more than one product. And so a company that has a diversified product range, it's hard to know how much of the expenses that they incur for management, how much of the expenses they incur for utilities and rent should go to any one of the individual projects. What we're going to be looking at today is just an easy way to account for indirect costs and to decide this allocation. Allocation is deciding, if you know your expenses, where should the expenses go? Who has to pay them? Because they have to be recovered. If the company doesn't recover these indirect costs, then actually they'll be losing money. And sometimes that's the temptation, is if you think about a restaurant that you go to, sometimes you can look at the food that's in front of you and say, I don't know why the prices are so high, because here I see meat, I see some bread and some hummus. And so those three things you can get at the store for very low prices. You maybe look at the food and see only 7 dirhams of expenses, but then you have to think about the indirect costs. So in addition to the food that they deliver to your table, the business is also providing a place for you to eat, a chair to sit on, air conditioning so that the temperature isn't too hot. Maybe they have security or decorations, and so there's a lot of extra expenses that it's not directly reflected into the food in front of you, but you want to pay for the environment, and you want to pay for the organization and the service. And so those indirect costs have to be recovered by the business. You can't only sell things for the amount of the direct costs. So here are some different categories that are considered indirect costs on a typical basis. This is taken from your textbook. Taxes are something that we don't have to worry about too much yet here in the Emirates, but it's coming right around the corner. They're starting to already plan for what's called a value-added tax. And if you're not acquainted with the value-added tax, the way that works is that any time a material changes hands, there's a small tax that's paid on that transaction. So that if a manufacturer is buying raw plastic from a chemical company, they would pay a certain percentage of the purchase price to the government of that transaction. And then the manufacturing company maybe is making something and they sell it to a retailer. And so the manufacturing company is maybe taking it to Carrefour. And so on the transaction from the manufacturing company to Carrefour, there's another value added that has to be recovered. And then the final transaction from the retailer to the customer, then there's another tax that's allocated. So every step, they call that a value-added tax, because every person who takes possession of the item is adding some sort of value. The manufacturer is taking plastic and turning it into something useful. The retailer is providing space for customers to come learn about the product and take it. And so every step is taxed. So that's one kind of category that has to be recovered in a certain way. And you have to figure out when you're selling something on what basis to recover those costs. In one case, it's saying if it's a property tax that you're having to pay, because there's a lot of different kinds of tax: income, value-added, sales, and property tax is one of the possibilities. If you have a building and you're paying the government every year a registration fee or a property tax, then you can pass that tax along to your occupants on the basis of how much space they occupy. So think, if you have a large warehouse and you have 3 tenants in your large warehouse, it's not fair to charge every tenant the same amount to cover the taxes if one of your tenants has a small space, one has a medium, and one has a huge. You wouldn't simply divide those tax costs that you're passing along by 3. So this is saying you allocate on some sort of a rational basis, that if you're paying taxes on the basis of space, then you should pass along those expenses on the same basis. So airlines have fuel surcharges sometimes, and you'll pay a larger fuel surcharge if you have a long flight because the plane is consuming more fuel. So each one of these are cost categories that can sometimes have indirect costs associated with them. For instance, quality control, an inspector who is on the line making sure that whatever is being produced meets certain standards. Well, the number of inspections that's being done by that quality control inspector would be one way to pass along the cost. So each one of these gives you some ideas of a fair way to pass along indirect costs, because no one wants to pay for indirect cost. Everyone thinks that someone else is causing a greater burden on the system compared to their activities, and so it's just sort of human nature to want your indirect costs to be as low as possible. So here is your first chance to get some practice with passing along the expenses. There is a holding company, meaning a parent company that has under its umbrella several subdivisions. This is a construction company that has excavation, steel assembly, and surveying. They have those 3 activities under the same roof. Well, they have to recover some of their costs, the parent company does, and you get the idea from the problem statement in the table. This construction company has these 3 cost centers, as they're called. Now, it's called a cost center because the indirect costs are being generated by each of these divisions. And so you can see basically how many people each division has, how much revenue they have coming in, the number of projects. And so the question is if you have to allocate $6.95 million, that's, the management expenses, the rent, maybe it includes some sort of the health insurance, these are all of the indirect costs that are related to these sorts of categories, all lumped together. You have to recover $6.9 million. So the question is, who has to pay how much? Should you simply divide this $6.9 million by 3 and say each division has to pay 1/3? Maybe that's not fair because, for instance, the surveying division only has 7 employees and the steel assembly has 43 employees. And so the surveying division would probably say we should do it on the basis of employees, not simply dividing it by 3. But maybe steel and surveying look at the excavation company and say the excavation company is making so much revenue. So maybe we should base recovering the indirect costs on the base revenue, and so on. So there's different arguments to be made depending on your perspective. So steps A through D, I'd like you to consider how much has to be recovered according to different methods. And I think you'll get the idea as you start working on it. And of course, it's fine to collaborate with your classmates as you go through this one. Let's just take a look at the first couple of parts, part A and B. I want to see if everyone's on the right track so far. All right, so for part A, the first thing that I did was I found the total revenue for the entire company, including the 3 divisions together. So we find that the total revenue is about $17.5 million. So the next steps, you can find the percentage that each subdivision is contributing to that total. So the excavation company, I did it as a fraction rather than as a percentage, but it's the same thing really. 13.6 million out of 17.5. So I have that fraction of how much they're contributing to the overall parent company and multiply that by the amount they're having to recover. And so this is how much each subdivision is responsible for. The excavation company is responsible to give the main organization 5.3 million, and so on. So you can see each of the amounts. So part B is where things gets a little bit complicated, because now the excavation company is wondering how they're going to get the $5.3 million that they need to give to the parent company. Where should that money come from? And the idea that they have at the excavation company is that maybe they should recover a certain amount for every cubic meter of excavation that they're doing. And so if we go back up to the table, you can see that that company is excavating 180,000 cubic meters each year. And so they know they have to pay 5.3 million on the basis of 180,000 cubic meters. And so that's dollars per cubic meter. And so that's what we end up here with the 29.92, is that's how many dollars per cubic meter. So in addition to the normal charges, this isn't the total price that they charge their customers. They charge their customers what they have been charging in the past, but then they also need to add this amount on top of it to make sure that they can cover their direct costs and their indirect costs together. So now in part C, it's a similar idea. The steel company, it's not doing excavation. They're using the linear amount of steel reinforcing that's been assembled. So they're tying together steel cages. And so in their case, they're going to take the indirect costs and allocate it to the reinforcing steel. But then when you look at the surveying division, the thing that they do going out for a survey, it's not so easy to quantify on the basis of a certain amount. So they don't have some easy figure that they can say, we're going to charge our customers based on the length of steel or the volume of excavation. So in part D of the problem statement, what it's saying is, do it as a fraction of the original amount. So they're having to 1.4 million of revenue, and from step A, we found that the surveying crew should be contributing 554,000 to the parent company, and so find what is the fraction that they should pass along to their customers, and that's what you do for part D. Let me pause it again so you can finish on part 1 of the in-class exercise. Let me explain part D. It maybe looks more complicated than it needs to, but I think you'll have the idea pretty easily. So 1 plus F, previously in the last class lecture we were talking about direct costs and indirect costs. So 1 is the direct cost, F is the indirect cost. So together, if you multiply the direct and the indirect by the base revenue amount of 1.4 million, then what you're looking for is you want the total to be the indirect costs that they have to recover, and the direct costs. So basically, we're just solving for F in this relationship. We're trying to find out what should be the percentage if you want the total amount to be how much they're giving to the company for indirect, and then their base revenue of 1.4 million. So 39.6% is the indirect cost recovery that should be used for the surveying division. Before we move on from part one, are there any questions about indirect cost allocation?
So how come you couldn't do the same thing? Why
We could have, yeah. So his question is, why not just use a percentage for the other ones as well? It would be possible, but I guess the argument to be made for the excavation company is that maybe they're giving some customers a discount, and rather than be on the basis of revenue, they want it to be on the base of excavation, so that every customer is sharing an equal amount of indirect cost based on excavation. That would just be sort of a policy decision, but from like a technical computational standpoint, you could have calculated an F value for both excavation and steel. All right, so here's the second part of today's class, talking about the ABCs. It's called activity-based costing. And we need to start with a little bit of terminology so that the phrases that are used in activity-based costing are understandable. The first thing is a cost center. The cost center, I sort of think that the language is actually a little bit reversed from what you might expect. But a cost center is what the company is producing. So that could be the services that it gives out, or the products that are being made. And the reason why it's called a cost center is that the costs, the indirect costs that have to be recovered, you have to lump it on to the thing that the company is doing, the activity. And so the true cost of operations includes the direct and the indirect costs, and so these cost centers receive the allocated indirect costs. So if we go back to the example we've just done, these are allocated indirect costs. The parent company said excavation has to pay this much, steel has to pay this much, so these are allocated. That means it's divided up among different centers. And so if we look at this terminology, it's saying that each of the cost centers receive the allocated indirect costs. So the activities are the backup and support elements of the company that are using the money that is being allocated to these cost centers. So the quality control inspector, that person has to earn a salary, and the money for that salary is going to come from these cost centers. IT department, supervising. So these are generating the indirect cost because they're the ones who are providing the services. That's how they generate the indirect cost, is by the services that they provide to the cost centers. And then the cost drivers are the volumes. And so in the in-class exercise that we were looking at before, the drivers are the volume excavated, the length of reinforcing steel that's been assembled, and we didn't have a very easy driver to allocate for the surveying division. So that's what we mean by some of that language. Other types of drivers maybe would be the number of orders that are being placed if you have a purchasing department that needs to receive money. Or in the case of IT departments, here, if you have a problem with your computer, then you send an email to the IT department and they create something called a ticket. It's just sort of like an entry in their computer system for keeping track of problems. And so maybe some people are really bad at computers and they're generating a lot of tickets, right? That's kind of the idea behind the second part of this in-class exercise for today. Is let's say that there is a college that has 3 majors. In a certain university, there's a college that has an engineering division, a safety division, and a computer science division. So the IT department inside of that college is getting a lot of calls. They have support staff and a budget of $145,000. So they're doing the same thing as before, trying to figure out who's going to pay for that budget. So maybe one way to decide how much has to come from each division is just divide the number by 3. But if you look at the statistics, it maybe seems like that wouldn't be fair, because the safety technology department only has 4 professors compared to engineering has 12 professors. So why should safety pay 1/3 of the support bill if they have so many fewer people? But then maybe another way of looking at it is the number of students that each program has, or the number of support calls. Why do you think the computer science college has so few support calls? Only 2 support calls per week compared to 6 with the safety department. Yeah, they're probably already very acquainted with computers, so they don't need as much help as the safety technology people. Maybe they're generating more requests, and so they possibly are required to pay more of the budget. So what I'd like you to do is just very easily, Part A and Part B, figure up in this activity-based costing how much of the budget should be allocated based on these 2 different approaches. On your paper, does it also say step C, number of students? Okay, well also I should have, okay, so step C is number of students. All right, so A, B, and C. Yeah, I think you've got the main idea. Good.
Sir, what's it for the final?
Hmm?
What's it for the final?
What's the final?
Yeah, what's it for the final?
Everything. Comprehensive. Yeah. The whole semester. So let me ask you something. If you are the department chair for engineering, what do you think the cost allocation basis should be? What's your perspective? If you are in charge of the engineering division and the dean of the college is saying, we have to have a meeting to decide how we're going to divide up the IT calls. If you're the engineering department, then what do you want? You'd say, let's see, which one is the lowest for engineering? Seems like the number of computers is going to have to mean that I pay the least, right? So probably the engineering chair is going to the meeting saying, I really think that it makes the most sense, it's the most fair if we do it on the basis of the number of computers, probably, right? And if you're going to the meeting and you are in the safety division, you don't want them to be knowing that you have so many calls because, you know, the safety people are bad at computers or whatever. So if you're in the safety department, you say, well, I think the best way for us to allocate the costs would be computers also. The computer science division, though, wouldn't like that one bit because they probably think we're so good at computers, we're not generating any of the support. So the computer science division wants it to be on the basis of support calls. And so 2 people vote for computers, 1 person votes for support calls, and probably the dean should say, let's just do it on the basis of students, because that splits the difference, and if no one's happy, then that means the dean has done his job correctly, or her job correctly, right? What's that? Yeah. You could have a weighted average. 30% this one, 30% that one, like maybe it's an average in between. And actually, the real question is, you need to analyze the time of the IT department. Like, how much of their time do they spend going each semester imaging the machines? How much of their time is actually related to support calls? How much of their time is related to the number of students? So maybe the fair way to do it isn't just to look at the data that you have, but actually what's driving the costs themselves. All right, so on the horizon, you've got a homework due on Thursday, the bonus quiz on Sunday. Remember, the coverage of the bonus quiz is related to the course in general. The idea being that it starts you on your journey of preparing for our comprehensive final exam. So I'll see you on Thursday. Have a good day.